The disturbing case of Anatoly Moskvin, a tale of academic brilliance and dark obsession. In the autumn of 2011, police officers in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, stepped into an apartment that would reveal one of the most bizarre and unsettling cases in modern criminal history. What they discovered inside the home of renowned academic Anatoly Moskvin appeared, at first glance, to be an eccentric collection of life-size dolls. Each was carefully dressed in elegant clothing, adorned with makeup, and positioned throughout the living space as if part of a macabre display. However, the truth behind these dolls would soon send shockwaves through the community. They were, in fact, the mummified remains of 29 young women and girls, some of whom had been in Moskvin's possession for nearly 2 decades. Born on September 1, 1966, in what was then known as Gorky City, now Nizhny Novgorod, Anatoly Moskvin entered the world as the only child of Yuri Fedorovich and Elvira Alexandrovna. Despite his quiet nature, Moskvin's intellectual capabilities became apparent early in his life. His academic journey would eventually lead him to Moscow State University, where he distinguished himself by earning degrees in both philology and history during the 1980s. Moskvin's scholarly achievements were remarkable by any standard. He mastered an impressive 13 languages, developed extensive expertise in Celtic history and folklore, and earned a reputation in academic circles as an eclectic genius. His professional life seemed to follow a conventional path. He secured a position as a lecturer at the Institute of Foreign Languages and began contributing articles to local newspapers, including a publication called Necrologies that specialized in cemetery documentation and obituaries. Between 2005 and 2007, Moskvin embarked on an ambitious project that would earn him the title of cemetery expert in Nizhny Novgorod. His dedication to documenting local burial grounds was extraordinary. He visited and meticulously recorded details from over 750 cemeteries. These extensive investigations resulted in 2 comprehensive works: Great Walks Around Cemeteries and What the Dead Said. His commitment to this research bordered on obsessive. Nearly every night, Moskvin would walk up to 20 miles, exploring cemeteries with an intensity that went beyond academic interest. He would sleep in abandoned barns, drink from puddles, and even spent one night atop a coffin scheduled for burial the next day. While these behaviors might have seemed eccentric to observers, they were merely the visible surface of a much darker preoccupation. According to Moskvin's own account, his fixation with death and cemeteries originated from a deeply traumatic incident in 1979, when he was just 13 years old. Walking home from school one afternoon, he encountered a funeral procession for an 11-year-old girl named Natasha Petrova, who had died from accidental electrocution. Men dressed in black suits, mourners at the funeral, allegedly accosted the young Moskvin and forced him to kiss the deceased girl's face. In a bizarre twist, Natasha's mother then placed a ring on both Moskvin's and the dead girl's fingers, performing what Moskvin would later describe as a macabre marriage ceremony. This disturbing encounter had a profound psychological impact on the teenage Moskvin. He began experiencing intense nightmares in which Natasha's spirit would appear to him, urging him to learn dark arts that could resurrect her from the dead. In an attempt to suppress these haunting dreams, Moskvin began experimenting with various rituals meant to keep spirits away. This experimentation led him to join a satanic cult, where he shared his nightmares with other members. However, he later expressed regret at having cast Natasha away, and became determined to master the dark arts she had spoken of in his dreams. During the 1990s, Moskvin's fascination with death evolved into an elaborate system of beliefs and practices. He immersed himself in researching ancient rituals, particularly those that supposedly enabled communication with the dead. Drawing inspiration from Celtic Druid traditions, he adopted the practice of lying upon graves, believing this would allow him to hear the voices of the deceased. His methodology became increasingly systematic. He would carefully read through obituaries, paying particular attention to deaths of young children. When he found a case that spoke to him, he would visit the grave and lie upon it, convinced that this ritual would allow the child's spirit to communicate its desires to him. By 2009, families began reporting signs of grave tampering, though few could have imagined the true nature of these disturbances. Moskvin had begun removing bodies from their graves, specifically selecting those he claimed had requested resurrection through spiritual communication. His process was methodical and calculated, taking advantage of his parents' frequent extended stays at their summer cottage to bring bodies into their shared apartment. Using a mixture of salt and baking soda, Moskvin developed his own mummification technique. He would carefully preserve each body, then dress it in the clothing it had been buried in. He applied makeup to their faces and attached toy eyes, explaining later that this allowed them to watch cartoons with him. In a particularly unsettling detail, he inserted music boxes into some of the bodies and wrapped their faces in nylon stockings, stuffing their bodies with rags to maintain their shape and softness. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary aspects of this case was how long Moskvin maintained his grotesque collection while living with his parents. They later claimed they had viewed their son's doll collection as strange but ultimately harmless, a peculiar hobby of an eccentric academic. This belief persisted even as their apartment filled with these life-sized figures, each carefully positioned and maintained by their son. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved 10-year-old Olga Chardomova. Originally murdered by a drug addict who had attempted to steal her earrings, Olga's body was taken by Moskvin in 2003. For 9 years, he engaged in a cruel charade, leaving notes and gifts at her empty grave signed as Dobry Angel, kind angel. He would write messages congratulating her on holidays, tracking what would have been her progress through school years, and referring to her as Little Lady. This torment lasted until his arrest, forcing Olga's mother, Natalia, to endure the trauma of burying her daughter twice, the second time in an unmarked grave to prevent further desecration. The case broke open in 2011, following an investigation into cemetery vandalism connected to a terrorist attack at Moscow's Domodedovo airport. Police found Moskvin painting over images of deceased Muslims in a cemetery, leading to a search of his apartment that revealed his horrifying collection. During questioning, Moskvin was surprisingly cooperative, explaining his motivations and methods in detail. He offered several justifications for his actions. He claimed he was rescuing the children from cold, dark graves where their parents had abandoned them. He spoke of his own loneliness and thwarted desires to adopt a child, which had been denied due to his low salary. Perhaps most bizarrely, he expressed hope that scientific advancement would eventually enable him to resurrect his children. During his trial for desecration of graves and dead bodies under Article 244 of the Criminal Code, psychiatric evaluation determined that Moskvin suffered from schizophrenia. Deemed unfit to stand trial, he was committed to a psychiatric facility. In 2018, despite claims of improvement, his potential release was denied, particularly after he allegedly warned parents not to rebury their children, as he would dig them up again upon release. The case's impact rippled through the community. Moskvin's former colleagues distanced themselves, and his parents became social outcasts. His mother Elvira was so devastated by the public backlash that she contemplated suicide, though her husband prevented this. Today, Moskvin remains institutionalized, his case serving as a haunting reminder of how intellectual brilliance can coexist with the darkest of obsessions. The legacy of Moskvin's crimes continues to affect families throughout Nizhny Novgorod, many of whom still struggle with the knowledge that their loved one's eternal rest was so horrifically disturbed. His case stands as one of the most bizarre and disturbing instances of grave desecration in modern history, combining elements of academic excellence, psychological trauma, and profound human tragedy. The man who vanished into thin air. The security camera footage shows a familiar scene, a young man in a dark shirt, standing outside a college bar on a warm spring night. He's chatting with two women, smiling, completely at ease. It's 1:55 a.m. on April 1st, 2006, and Brian Schaffer has about 5 minutes left in the visible world. The camera catches him turning towards the entrance of the ugly Tuna Saluna. He walks forward, and then, nothing. Brian Schaffer simply ceases to exist. This isn't a magic trick. There's no trapdoor, no smoke and mirrors, no elaborate illusion. Just a 27-year-old medical student who walked into a bar and never walked out. The security cameras that captured his entrance never recorded his exit. It's as if the building swallowed him whole. The night had started normally enough. Brian and his friend Clint Florence were celebrating the end of their medical school exams and the beginning of spring break at Ohio State University. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was both their first and last stop that night, after getting a ride back from Clint's friend, Meredith Reed. The three of them were having one final round before closing time when Brian separated from the group. When 2 a.m. rolled around and the lights came up, Clint and Meredith waited outside for their friend. Minutes ticked by. No Brian. They assumed he'd slipped away early, maybe headed home for some much-needed sleep after their night of celebration. It wasn't until Monday morning, when Brian failed to show up for his flight to Miami with his girlfriend, a trip where many believed he planned to propose, that anyone realized something was terribly wrong. The police investigation quickly uncovered the puzzling nature of Brian's disappearance. The Ugly Tuna had exactly 2 exits: the main entrance, watched by that vigilant security camera, and a service door that led to a treacherous construction site, a maze of equipment and debris that would have been challenging to navigate even in broad daylight, let alone drunk in the dark. The security footage showed Brian approaching the entrance. It never showed him leaving. What followed was one of the most thorough searches in Columbus history. Police combed through footage from every security camera in the area. They searched dumpsters, sewers, and crawl spaces. K-9 units sniffed their way through the neighborhood. Nothing. Not a trace. The investigation spawned a tapestry of theories, each more intriguing than the last. Some believed Brian, devastated by his mother's recent death, had chosen to disappear. Others whispered about the construction site behind the bar, suggesting a tragic accident covered up to avoid liability. The more imaginative minds connected his case to the theoretical smiley face killer, who supposedly targeted college-aged men leaving bars. Even Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder, knowing Brian was a huge fan, paused during a Cincinnati concert to ask for information about the disappearance. The silence that followed was deafening. Hope flickered briefly in September when Brian's girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, who had been calling his phone nightly, finally heard it ring. 3 rings, then nothing. A ping from a cell tower in Hilliard, 14 miles away, tantalized investigators before being dismissed as a possible system glitch. The case took darker turns. Brian's apartment was burglarized, though the crime proved unrelated. His father, Randy Schaffer, desperate for answers, waded through the Olentangy River after a psychic claimed Brian's body was near a bridge. In a cruel twist of fate, Randy would die 2 years later, struck by a falling branch while cleaning storm debris from his yard. Even death couldn't stop the mysteries. Someone left a message in Randy's online condolence book. To Dad, love Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands. Police traced it to a public computer in Franklin County, Ohio. Another dead end. Another cruel hoax. The investigation continued to spawn leads that led nowhere. Alleged sightings in Sweden, a waiter in Michigan who looked just like him, anonymous tips about body locations that proved false. Everyone involved in that night took lie detector tests, except Clint Florence, who through his attorney maintained he'd told police everything he knew. In 2018, the Ugly Tuna Saloon closed its doors forever. As workers stripped away the old bar to convert it into office space, they dismantled the last physical connection to that puzzling April night. The building that had seemingly swallowed Brian Schaffer whole was itself disappearing, taking any remaining secrets with it. To this day, no one knows what happened to Brian Schaffer. The security cameras saw him walk toward a bar entrance and then nothing. No exit. No clues, no resolution, just questions that echo through time, growing louder with each passing year. Somewhere between the frames of that security footage, between 1:55 a.m. and closing time, between one step and the next, Brian Schaffer walked into a bar and vanished into thin air. And unlike an April Fool's joke, there was no punchline. Just an enduring mystery that continues to haunt Columbus, Ohio, leaving us to wonder, how can someone simply disappear in plain sight? The last tenant of room 209. I never wanted to work at Thornfield Hall. The advertisement in the local paper seemed innocent enough. Caretaker needed for historic property, living quarters provided, competitive salary. But something about the wording felt off, like reading a familiar sentence written in a slightly wrong font. Still, beggars can't be choosers. And after losing my job at the museum during COVID cuts, I was definitely begging. The property management company's office in Leeds was modern and sleek, a stark contrast to the weathered photographs of Thornfield Hall that decorated their walls. The interview lasted exactly 7 minutes, and I got the distinct impression they were more relieved than pleased to hire me. "The caretaker's cottage is, well maintained," Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting her glasses, "though it hasn't been occupied since the incident." I should have asked about the incident, but the thought of having my own place again, away from my parents' spare room and their constant worried glances, made me bite back the question. The cottage sat at the edge of Thornfield's grounds, a small stone building partially hidden by overgrown yew trees. My first impression was that it looked like something from a fairy tale, the kind where children get eaten. The front garden was wild with weeds, but I could see the bones of what had once been a lovely space. The kitchen window caught the afternoon light perfectly, and despite the musty smell inside, I felt immediately at home. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. The first night, I attributed the scratching sounds to mice. The second night, when I heard footsteps in the attic, I told myself it was the old wooden beams settling. But on the third night, when I woke to find all the kitchen cupboards open and a single word written in frost on the window, "Leave," I knew I had a problem. I did what any sensible person would do. I Googled the property's history. The incident, as it turned out, was a suicide. The previous caretaker, Daniel Morris, had been found hanging from the attic rafters 2 years ago. The article mentioned he'd left a note, but its contents weren't disclosed. That should have been enough to send me packing. Instead, I found myself growing angry. I'd finally found a place of my own, a job that could help me rebuild my life, and some vindictive spirit thought they could scare me away? Not bloody likely. The next morning, I marched into the kitchen and spoke to the empty air. "Listen here, mate. I'm not leaving. You can bang around all you like, but this is my home now, too." The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. The tap turned on by itself, spraying water across the kitchen counter. I stood my ground. "Real mature. You know I have to clean that up, right?" The water shut off. A cupboard slammed. Then silence. That evening I found an old photo album in the attic. Most of the pictures were of Thornfield Hall in its glory days, but tucked in the back was a more recent snapshot. A man stood in front of the cottage, maybe mid-30s, with kind eyes and a sad smile. Daniel Morris, I presumed. He was holding a garden trowel and wearing muddy boots. The garden had been his project, I realized. The overgrown mess outside was probably killing him. Well, metaphorically speaking. I spent the weekend clearing weeds and turning soil. It was backbreaking work, but satisfying. As I dug up the old flower beds, I found odd little things buried in the earth. A pocket watch, some old coins, a child's marble. I lined them up on the kitchen windowsill. That night, the scratching sounds returned, but they were different, more purposeful. I went downstairs and found new words written in frost. "Dig deeper." I should have called the police. Instead, I went out with a torch and started digging where I'd found the trinkets. 3 feet down, my spade hit something solid. A metal box, about the size of a shoebox, locked and rusted. The key was on my windowsill the next morning, though I know I'd locked all the doors and windows. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Daniel Morris from someone named Elizabeth. They started off loving, became desperate, then angry. The last one was dated a week before Daniel's death. "I know what you did with the money," it read. "The police are involved now. It's over." I spent the rest of the night reading through property records and old news articles. Daniel Morris hadn't just been the caretaker. He'd been embezzling from the property management company for years. The money was never found. The next morning, I woke to find my laptop open to my banking app. A new account had been added, one containing just over $200,000. The password hint was Elizabeth's birthday. That's when things got really complicated. The ghost, Daniel, became more active. He'd move things around the cottage, switch lights on and off, and occasionally managed to manifest enough to appear as a shadowy figure in corners. But he wasn't trying to scare me anymore. He was trying to tell me something. The problem was, he wasn't the only one. It started with footsteps in the garden at night, then scratching at the windows. Finally, a woman's voice calling Daniel's name. The first time I heard it, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Daniel's response was more dramatic. Every light in the cottage exploded. I found Elizabeth's death certificate the next day. She'd died 6 months after Daniel, ruled a suicide like him. But something felt wrong about both deaths. The property management company started sending more frequent inspections. Mrs. Henderson would show up unannounced, asking odd questions about whether I'd noticed anything unusual. She seemed particularly interested in the garden. One night, I woke to find both ghosts in my room. Daniel stood by the window, while Elizabeth's form hovered near the door. The temperature was so cold my teeth chattered. "They killed us," Elizabeth's voice whispered. "The company. They found out we knew." Daniel's ghost flickered, then pointed to the garden. I spent the next day digging. Under the flower beds, past the trinkets, deeper than the money box, I found them. Documents, ledgers, proof of something much bigger than Daniel's small-time embezzlement. The property management company had been running a massive money laundering operation through their historic properties for decades. That's when Mrs. Henderson showed up with 2 men I'd never seen before. They weren't carrying clipboards this time. What happened next is still a blur. I remember running into the cottage. I remember the men following. I remember Daniel's ghost throwing every piece of furniture he could manage at them, and Elizabeth's spirit screaming so loudly the windows shattered. I remember the gunshot. I don't remember falling. I woke up in hospital 3 days later. The official story was that I'd interrupted a burglary. Mrs. Henderson and her associates were in custody, facing charges that went well beyond money laundering. The documents I'd found had been very thorough. When I finally returned to the cottage, it was different. Peaceful. The garden bloomed, despite the winter frost, and the scratching in the walls had stopped. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I catch glimpses of them. Daniel tending to his flowers, Elizabeth reading by the window. They're not angry anymore. They're just watching, protecting. I could move somewhere else now. The reward money from breaking the case would let me live anywhere I want. But the cottage is home now, and I'm not alone here. Besides, someone needs to tend the garden, though I do wish they'd stop reorganizing my kitchen cupboards. Carl Tanzler, A Dark Tale of Obsession Beyond Death. On a balmy October evening in 1940, the whispers that had long circulated through Key West, Florida, finally led to a grotesque discovery. Local residents had reported glimpses through windows of an elderly man dancing with what appeared to be a life-sized doll. But when Elena de Hoyos' sister Florinda pushed open the door to Carl Tanzler's home that day, she found something far more horrifying. The preserved corpse of her long-dead sister, stolen from her tomb 7 years earlier. The story begins in Dresden, Germany, where Georg Karl Tanzler was born on February 8, 1877. His early life was shaped by peculiar visions that would later fuel his obsession. He claimed that the spirit of his ancestor, Countess Anna Constantia von Cosel, visited him in dreams, showing him the face of his destined true love, an exotic, dark-haired beauty he had yet to meet. Tanzler's life before his infamous crime reads like an adventure novel. He escaped Germany before World War I, finding himself in Australia, where he pursued his interest in engineering and began constructing a trans-ocean flyer. The war interrupted his plans, and British authorities, wary of his German heritage, placed him in a concentration camp for safekeeping. After his release in 1918, Tanzler defied restrictions and returned to Germany in 1920, where he married Doris Schaefer and had 2 children. But domestic life couldn't tame his wanderlust. In 1926, he emigrated to the United States, settling first in Zephyrhills, Florida. His family joined him, but Tanzler's restless spirit soon led him to Key West, where he secured work as a radiology technician at Marine Hospital. It was at this hospital in 1930 that the 53-year-old Tanzler first laid eyes on Elena de Hoyos, and his childhood visions suddenly took flesh. The 20-year-old Cuban-American beauty had already lived through her share of tragedy. Married at 17, she had suffered a miscarriage that led to her marriage's dissolution, and now she faced an even grimmer diagnosis: tuberculosis. In Elena's dark eyes and exotic features, Tanzler saw the woman from his dreams materialized. His response was immediate and overwhelming. Despite having no expertise in treating tuberculosis, he appointed himself her personal physician. For 18 months, he lavished her with attention, unauthorized treatments, and expensive gifts. He brought medical equipment to her home and proclaimed his love, though no evidence suggests Elena ever returned his affections. On October 23, 1931, despite Tanzler's efforts, Elena succumbed to her illness. She was just 22 years old. Tanzler, devastated but still obsessed, paid for an elaborate funeral and mausoleum. For 2 years, he made daily visits to her tomb, singing to her and claiming her spirit spoke to him in return. In 1933, Tanzler's obsession took a dark turn. Claiming Elena's spirit had begged him to rescue her from her tomb, he crept into the cemetery one night with a toy wagon and stole her decomposing body. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing chapter of this macabre tale. In a makeshift laboratory he called Elena's Starship, Tanzler began what he saw as Elena's restoration. Using piano wire and coat hangers, he reconstructed her skeletal frame. He stuffed her torso with rags and towels to restore its shape. Her decomposing skin was wrapped in silk bandages soaked in wax and plaster. Glass eyes replaced her own, and a wig made from her own fallen hair was stapled to her skull. To mask the inevitable odor of decay, he doused both the corpse and his home with disinfectants and perfumes. For 7 years, this grotesque secret remained hidden. Tanzler slept beside his creation every night, dressing her in fine clothes and jewelry, maintaining her decomposing form with constant repairs. A tube-like apparatus found in the corpse's pelvic region later raised disturbing questions about possible necrophilia, though Tanzler never admitted to such acts. The truth emerged when neighbors spotted Tanzler dancing with his ghastly partner through his windows. When Elena's sister Florinda investigated, she was horrified to discover what she initially thought was a wax effigy was actually her sister's preserved corpse. The ensuing trial captured public imagination, but surprisingly, many viewed Tanzler with sympathy rather than revulsion. Despite his shocking admission during psychiatric evaluation that he had planned to fly Elena's corpse high into the stratosphere to restore her to life through cosmic radiation, he was found fit to stand trial. However, the statute of limitations had expired on his grave robbery, and he was released. In a final indignity to Elena's memory, her preserved body was put on public display at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home, where nearly 7,000 people came to view it before she was finally laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Tanzler's story took even darker turns after his release. He moved to Pasco County, Florida in 1944, where his long-suffering wife Doris cared for him in his final years. Unable to let go of his obsession, he created a life-size doll of Elena using a death mask. When Tanzler died on July 3, 1952, at age 75, some claimed he was found in the arms of this doll, though more reliable sources say he was discovered on the floor near it. Years later, renovations to his former home allegedly revealed a chilling confession note suggesting he had poisoned Elena with aconite and wolfsbane, explaining the violent convulsions noted before her death. The discovery linked disturbingly well with Elena's autopsy report, which Tanzler had kept secret, only verbally revealing that she had experienced violent convulsions before death, symptoms consistent with aconite poisoning, as documented in modern medical literature. Carl Tanzler's story remains one of the most disturbing tales of obsession in American history. It serves as a dark reminder of how love, when twisted by madness, can transform into something unrecognizable and horrific. In the end, neither Elena in life nor death could escape the desperate fixation of a man who claimed she was his destiny.